The Otagos spent most of the winter following the Somme campaign, back defending the Armentières sector in northern France and Belgium. The heavy casualties sustained through 1916 did not stop them from continuing their trench raids into 1917. Then, in April of 1917, both of the Otago battalions were withdrawn from the line to undertake 3 weeks of intensive training in preparation for a great offensive, the attack on the Messines Ridge in Belgium. This would arguably be the Otago's greatest success of the war.
A lot of us think 1917, Passchendaele in October, and the terrible disaster that was. Messines, on the other hand, it was an opportunity to remove the Germans from a high point. When you see Messines, it is higher than the surrounding countryside, and any high spot on the Western Front had the advantage. You could see, you could put your troops up there, it was harder to attack it, and it was devastating when you were spotting for the artillery. You could actually see all the targets beneath you.
Unlike most of the other battles, it was well organised. Things were coordinated between artillery and men in a way that hadn't happened everywhere, because the tunnellers in particular had dug underneath the Germans, and 20 of the big 22 mines that planted went off. It completely destroyed the German superior trench system, which was dry and deep, but if you actually put mines underneath it, then they had no way of coping with that, and something like 10,000 Germans were knocked out instantly, which was awful, but effective in terms of the fighting.
This is the Sprandbuchmolen crater, otherwise known as the Pool of Peace. It was one of 19 deep mines that had been tunnelled in under the German lines by the British over a period of 2 years in preparation for the attack on Messines Ridge, and they were all simultaneously detonated at 3 o'clock in the morning or just after that, and the effect on the German lines was incredibly devastating. 10,000 Germans are thought to have been killed in the initial explosions, and confusion reigned among the rest, who were easy targets for the Allied forces sweeping through their lines. Look at it. Imagine that blowing sky high and the poor old Germans on top and all around. What an impact. But what we like looking at here is across the flat land towards the Messines Ridge itself. You can see what a little bump it really is. In New Zealand terms, it's hardly a hill, but that ridge and the height it gave, the strategic advantage it gave to the Germans, was what the whole Battle of Messines was all about. And we can see over there towards the direction of Messines, that was where the New Zealanders swept up towards the village itself, but the whole battle occupied the entire frontage way off in that direction past White Sheet, much bigger than just our little part of it. But that's what it was all about, that little hill.
Russell was able to get his men training for a long time on country in which they were going to fight, so they were very familiar with the problems they were up against, and that's why we had a week or so of success. I mean, it doesn't last, unfortunately.
This marks the starting point for the Otago's attack on the 7th of June. Their main challenge in advancing up these slopes was a machine gun nest that they had to take out in the buildings at Birthday Farm. So this line marks the German defensive positions that the New Zealanders were attacking up the slope towards, and we have a concrete German pillbox or bunker off to the left here. Beyond that, on the tree line, there's a street which marks the divisional boundary. The Australians on the other side of that. New Zealand sector began at that road and ran along the bottom of the hill here, where their starting points were the trench that ran just at the bottom of the slope. In fact, we can see it directly in front of us just down here, where the tree line runs along a ditch. That's where it was, just in front of that. The street in the middle there marks the brigade boundary. So the New Zealand Rifle Brigade was on this left-hand side. Then from the street over to the next road, which is Messines, was the Otagos and the Canterbury's. Canterbury's here, Otagos over to the right. That was the New Zealand sector with those two brigades right across that frontage between the three roads. So here's the remaining German bunker just on the defensive line below the New Zealand Memorial at Messines. It was these that defined the defensive positions that the New Zealanders had to come up the slope and overcome, which they did very quickly on the 7th of June 1917. But you can see the concrete reinforcement and the way in which these are very strong structures, very hard to attack, and the Germans did this in depth all across the Western Front. Very impressive defensive structures, and no wonder they took so much to dislodge. Now, the Germans were masters of the defensive bunker, and their system of defences all along the Western Front was quite intricate, in depth, concrete reinforcing solid. But the point of these bunkers wasn't so that their soldiers could hide away there all the time. They were just to be used during artillery bombardments. So they were made really short. Inside it's only 1.2 metres high, pretty uncomfortable. So in you'd go during the bombardment. When it was finished, out you'd come ready to fight over top of the trenches, which you can see behind us here. In 1914, Adolf Hitler served in this area. Maybe he went into this bunker. Shame he ever came out. So here we are at the bottom of the slope just below the New Zealand Memorial, showing the way that the New Zealanders had to attack up the hill. This ditch here is just behind where their forward trenches were. That was the starting position. And at 3:10 a.m. when the big mines went off, they swept up those slopes. Now the New Zealand Division had the entire section in front of me to cover. The 3rd Rifle Brigade was on this side. The 2nd Brigade, which is the Canterburys and the Otagos, were over to the left over there, those slopes. That's what they swept up toward the village very quickly, very effectively on the 7th of June. The detonation of the huge underground mines and the accurate artillery fire had been successful in destroying the majority of the German defences. The Otagos now charged up the ridge and into the village of Messines, where the Germans had regrouped, but were pushed out after a period of hand-to-hand combat. This pre-war photograph of Messines shows the Institution Royale right at the centre of town with the big church. Now during the battle that was completely pulverised, and in the ruins the Germans were able to establish a very solid command post. So as the New Zealanders swept through the town, kind of effortlessly taking it, this is where they really struck trouble, and clearing out the ruins of the institution there was quite a challenge. And actually one member of the Rifle Brigade, Samuel Freckleton, won the Victoria Cross for clearing a number of machine gun posts near the church there. And this street, which follows the line of the New Zealand advance into the centre of Messines in 1917, the route of the Otagos, has been renamed New Zealand Street, New Zealand Strasse, Rue de Neo-Zélande after them. And these images show the utter destruction wrought on Messines by the battle in June 1917. Here's the ruins of the church. The Royal Institute had been wiped out as well. It was never rebuilt, the church was, but look at this pile of bricks which was all left of the main building in the centre of town. And here's a street. And here we can see Australian soldiers looking into German posts in the ruins of the buildings. So in liberating Messines, actually, it was completely destroyed. Not one building was left standing. With the village captured, the Otagos looked to consolidate their new positions on the high ground. But the Germans were not going to surrender the strategic advantage of the Messines Ridge so lightly. During the afternoon, they made repeated counterattacks to recapture all the ground that had been lost in the morning. When these failed, they used heavy artillery to shell the New Zealand positions. Many were killed and wounded from this barrage. Towards dusk, the Otago Mounted Rifles appeared to reconnoitre the land in front of the infantry positions. This would lead to the most famous episode in their history. So here we are at the site of the famous charge by the Otago Mounted Rifles at Messines. Now we haven't talked much about the Mounted Rifles as a unit since we were on Gallipoli, because once they got to the Western Front they were stripped down to just a squadron level, and there really wasn't any mounted work to do as such. They did traffic patrols, they did a lot of labouring work, but here at Messines was their one moment of glory. It was in the afternoon of the battle. The route forward for them had to be prepared by the New Zealand Cycling Battalion, their moment of glory. They had to fill in all the shell holes, cut the wire, and basically create a path for the horses. Once they got up to the brow of the hill, however, the Germans saw them and began shooting with their machine guns, and then it was a mad gallop to get back, avoiding the shell holes, avoiding the wire. Many horses were killed, a number of men were killed. It was kind of a crazy caper, but in the whole history of the regiment, it's the only time they rode into battle on their horses. And so I suppose it's kind of a special moment to remember. So here in the reconstructed central square of Messines is the statue of the New Zealand soldier, just unveiled on Anzac Day 2014. He probably represents Sergeant Freckleton, the VC winner in the battle. He's certainly a member of the New Zealand Rifle Brigade, he's certainly a sergeant, but nonetheless he represents the New Zealand soldier in his typical kit and caboodle, and I don't know of any other town on the Western Front that has in its centre a New Zealand soldier. You know, in all the places I've been to on the Western Front, all the museums in particular, The New Zealand participation in the battles gets a polite mention here and there alongside the Australians and the Canadians and the Brits and the Scots, but just a little mention, and in none of the displays has been any representation of our gear until now. Here in Messines, in this fabulous new interpretation centre just opened in 2014, we have a display of the whole kit of a member of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. And it's really exciting to see it. And in this whole museum, New Zealand's role, as they were in the Battle of Messines, is front and centre. So if you're going to come somewhere in Belgium and want to get a bit of a focus on the New Zealand participation in the battles, this is the place to come. Messines, or as it is called now, Messines. This ancient crypt beneath the Church of St Nicholas in Messines was used as a casualty aid post by the Germans in 1914, and a young corporal was treated here. His name was Adolf Hitler. The church was absolutely destroyed in the fighting that followed, and it took the people of Messines until 1938 to rebuild it in a modified, more modest version than the original. Just 2 years later, Hitler's troops marched back into Messines and reoccupied the town.
But the other thing too that happened there that didn't happen until the end of the war was we took quite a lot of prisoners. So this is a clear sign that we had caught the Germans by surprise, and there was a sort of mini capitulation. But you know, it's 1917, and all that success will soon be lost.
Standing by the New Zealand Memorial to the missing here in the Messines Ridge British Cemetery. This is very like the one that we saw at Longueval on the Somme. Where the cemetery is placed was occupied by 4 regimental aid posts during the Battle of Messines, the 7th to the 9th of June in 1917. They dealt with thousands and thousands of casualties in this area. Now the New Zealanders, despite this being an amazingly successful battle for them, ended up with 3,600 plus casualties, of which 700 were killed in action.
So to take a strong position like that, fortified by blockhouses, I mean the Germans had bunkers and blockhouses all around the place, and then tunnel under the German lines, put those mines underneath it, explode them in sequence, and then come over and take the German lines and push them back, was a feat of arms. It's just unfortunate, well it's worse than unfortunate, it's a tragedy that a feat of arms like that, for it to be a success, does require a cost of human lives.
When you see casualty lists coming from Messines, for example, and more than 500 New Zealanders killed in one day, it's hard to call it a success, isn't it? And yet 2 months later, 3 months later, 800 killed in one day, and it's a disaster.
So yes, the Otagos lost heavily, but the thing was they were well led. Despite their losses, they operated effectively, they captured the objectives. And let's face it, to achieve those objectives, a lot more Germans died as well. So overall, terrible cost of life to convince one side to give up some strategic land, which is now lovely rolling countryside. It's all farmland now.
Messines is remembered as a storied Allied victory, in which both the Otago Infantry Regiment and the Otago Mounted Rifles had played key roles. Again though, casualties had been high. Celebrations would be short-lived. The Otagos would soon go from their greatest high to their lowest low.